In this lecture, we will talk about neoclassical perspective on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So, according to neoclassicals, in the long run, business cycle will fluctuate around the potential or full employment level of output. So, neoclassicals always believe that whatever happens in the short run, in the long run, we will always end up in the long run equilibrium, which is the point where three curves, which is short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand intersects. Or to put it differently, if you remember when we talked about the fluctuations around potential GDP, suppose this is your time and this is your GDP and this is your potential GDP, and actual GDP kind of fluctuates. This is your so actual GDP fluctuates around the potential, and you can see all the time it is heading back to the long run equilibrium, and this is your long run point. These are your long run equilibrium. This is the point where so technically this is the point where three curves intersect together. Now here's the two basic building blocks of neoclassical economics. First, potential GDP determines the economic size. That means higher the potential GDP is, better off we are in the long run. And second is this, which is very important, that wages and prices will adjust in a flexible manner so that the economy will adjust back to its potential GDP level of output, which essentially means that prices and wages are always changing to accommodate demand and supply. So if price demand is very low, then prices will go down to increase demand. So the whole idea here in the neoclassical assumption or neoclassical world is that prices are flexible. So flexibility is the key of neoclassical economics. Now let me talk a little bit about the importance of potential GDP in the long run. Why neoclassicals always talk about potential GDP. Now over the long run, the level of potential GDP determines the size of real GDP. For example, in US, we have higher potential GDP, and that's why we have higher actual GDP, and that's why we enjoy better standard of living. While the unemployment in the labor market will never be zero because of natural rate of unemployment, full employment in the labor market refers to zero cyclical unemployment. And if you remember, cyclical unemployment caused by business cycles. So in the long run, we do not have any cyclical unemployment. Only unemployment we'll have is a natural rate of unemployment, which exists because we know always people are in transition. Finally, in the long run, GDP growth can be explained by increases in investment in physical capital and human capital per person, as well as advances in technology. Now, this is also very important from a neoclassical perspective. That means in an economy, what we need to care about is this, whether we are increasing our human capital, physical capital, and technology, because those are the things that affect aggregate supply and as a result, our potential GDP. So in the neoclassical world, these fluctuations in GDP or short-term unemployment is nothing to worry about, because economy will eventually go back to long-run equilibrium. And economists have a term for this, which is called self-adjustment mechanism. And the way self-adjustment mechanism works, because neoclassicals view that wages and prices are flexible over time. So let me show you how this self-adjustment mechanism works in real world, or rather supposed to work in the real world. So we'll start with a long run situation. So we have a short run aggregate supply we have long run aggregate supply, which is at y star is your potential GDP, and we have our aggregate demand. This is long run So we are starting with the long run equilibrium. For some reason, say short run aggregate supply shifted left, and we all know short run aggregate supply can shift left because of changes in input prices. Say there's an increase in oil prices, and as a result, short run aggregate supply shifted left. And let me show you left shift of the short run aggregate supply. So short run aggregate supply shifted left. As a result, we ended up in a short run equilibrium. As a result, our output Y decreased below the potential. So Y1 decreased below the potential GDP. Now neoclassicals believe that in the real world we'll eventually end up in the long run situation again. Now question is how it happens, and neoclassical believe in self-adjustment mechanism, and that works through changes in prices. So here's the logic behind it. So let me show you how the self-adjustment mechanism works. So self-adjustment mechanism. So start with the fact that actual GDP Y1 is below the potential. So GDP below potential. What's the result of this? Unemployment increases. So unemployment goes beyond the natural rate. Unemployment increases. When unemployment increases, real wages decrease. Remember, flexible wages that assumed by neoclassicals. So neoclassicals assume flexible wages. When real wages decrease, now firms has to pay less money to their workers, which means cost of production decreases. So as a result, cost of production decrease and profit increase. Now if profit increases, what happens to aggregate supply? Our short run aggregate supply start increasing. So short run aggregate supply increases. And how do we show it here? Our short run aggregate supply eventually start moving right. Increase is always right. So short run aggregate supply starts moving back, and it will go back from SRAS2 to SRAS, and eventually will come back to this long run equilibrium. So this is the self-adjustment mechanism, and the reason it worked because of adjustment in wages.